Good afternoon, and welcome to the first installment of a two-part Johns Hopkins briefing on the 2022 midterm elections. I'm Lainey Rutko, Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Initiatives at Johns Hopkins University, and I'll be moderating today's briefing. Today, experts from the SNF Agora Institute will discuss what they see as the potential implications for democracy following Tuesday's election results. Next week, a different panel will examine policy implications of the midterm elections across a variety of areas, including education, climate, and healthcare. Midterm elections often bring significant social, political, and policy changes at the federal and state levels. The results can potentially alter the power dynamics within government and determine the pace of progress for critical policies. As we saw just earlier this week, the party that controls the White House will try to maintain or gain control of Congress, while the opposition seeks to expand its legislative check on the executive branch. But those traditional checks and balances established by the Constitution have taken on a more toxic tone in recent years. This is the first national election since armed insurrectionists stormed the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, to try to disrupt the congressional certification of Joe Biden as president. That coordinated assault threatened to undermine a fundamental bedrock of American democracy, the peaceful transfer of power. And that leads us directly into the topic of today's briefing, the implications of this week's midterm elections for democracy. I'm grateful to the four experts who are taking part in today's session. Joining us today are Henry Farrell, SNF Agora Institute Professor of International Affairs at the Nitze School of Advanced International Studies and co-author of Privacy and Power, the Transatlantic Fight Over Freedom and Security, and the forthcoming book, Underground Empire, How America Weaponized the World's Markets, Networks, and Supply Chains. He studies democracy, the politics of the internet, and international and comparative political economy. Liliana Hall-Mason, SNF Agora Institute Associate Professor of Political Science at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, is the author of Uncivil Agreement, How Politics Became Our Identity. Her most recent book is Radical American Partisanship, mapping violent hostility, its causes, and the consequences for democracy. Her research is focused on partisan identity and bias, social sorting, and social polarization. Yascha Mounk is the SNF Agora Senior Fellow and an Associate Professor of the Practice of International Affairs at the Nitze School of Advanced International Studies and author of The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. He is a leading expert on the crisis of liberal democracy and the rise of populism. Finally, Leah Wright-Reger is an SNF Agora Institute Associate Professor of History at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, whose expertise includes 20th century US political and social history, modern African American history, the American presidency and presidential elections, civil rights movements, and protest and unrest in the United States. She is the author of The Loneliness of the Black Republican. Before I turn to each of our panelists for their initial remarks, I do want to remind our audience that we'll be providing answers to your questions in real time today. So please submit questions for our experts in the box that you see at the bottom of your screen. When you do so, if possible, please include your organizational affiliation. After each panelist gives an overview of key topics, we'll move to Q&A. Yascha, I'm going to turn to you first. What are we to make of how election deniers fared during these midterms, and what might that tell us about elections in the months and years to come?
Thanks for this question. I think that there's two headline findings, and the two headline findings actually go in different directions. So On one hand, it's very clear that election denialism is a key part of the current Republican Party, that election deniers did very well in the Republican primaries a number of months ago, and that people who explicitly stood up to Donald Trump's lies, who explicitly opposed Donald Trump because of his role in the insurrection on January 6, 2021, were not in every case, but in most cases pushed out of a political party. As a result, in Tuesday's election, over 200 election deniers got elected to offices at various levels of governance, and that is clearly very concerning. So we see that the strain of politicians who deny some of the most basic rules and norms of our political system have a real foothold in power, in public office, in an ongoing way, and that's deeply concerning. That's a very bad piece of news. Let me also say a little bit about the good piece of news, because political scientists for many years have been talking about the death of split-ticket voting. In a less polarized era, it was much more common for voters to say, hey, I find this particular Republican candidate is pretty moderate, I'm going to vote for this candidate, but other candidates more extreme, I'm not going to go vote for that candidate in that different race, I'm going to vote for the Democrat instead. And the idea was that split-ticket voting is not coming back. Well, one of the interesting phenomena on Tuesday was the return of split-ticket voting, and in particular the return of split-ticket voting where voters had a choice between a more extreme Republican candidate in one statewide race and a more moderate one in another statewide race. So let me give you two examples of that. The first example is from Georgia, where in the gubernatorial race, Brian Kemp was a Republican candidate. Kemp had been put under a lot of pressure by Donald Trump in 2020 to find the votes he needed to win that state. Kemp courageously stood up to those entreaties, had a really tough primary battle in which Trump did everything he could to ensure that Kemp wouldn't win the Republican nomination, survived the primary battle, and won with a very clear margin against Stacey Abrams on Tuesday. The other candidate was Herschel Walker, a Trump-endorsed candidate, a MAGA candidate, somebody who had a whole bunch of personal scandals, but who also emphasized his support of conspiracy theories about the 2020 election. Walker managed to squeak through to a runoff election, but he is trailing Raphael Warnock, the Democratic candidate, and took many, many, many fewer votes than Brian Kemp did. Another interesting contrast comes in Pennsylvania, where you have two Republican candidates, both endorsed by Donald Trump, both of whom lost. But there's nevertheless an important difference between them. Mehmet Oz stated clearly, the candidate for Senate, that he would have voted to certify the 2020 election. He ran mostly on economic issues. He lost to John Fetterman by about 3 percentage points. The other candidate, Doug Mastriano, was a main spreader of conspiracy theories about the 2020 election, actually was present in Washington, D.C. at the Trump rally on January 6, 2021, not on the assault on the Capitol, but in the rally that preceded it, and continued to contest the outcome of the election throughout his run in the last months. He lost not by 3 points like Oz did, but by 13 points, by a much, much, much larger margin. So I think the good news here is that a lot of Americans, and not just ones who've always voted for the Democratic Party, are recognizing the danger of some of its rhetoric, are concerned about it, and when they have candidates on the ballot that don't endorse those theories, they prefer them to the Republicans who do. I'm not a Republican, but I very much hope the Republican Party takes its lesson from that and realizes that it will maximize its chances of electoral victories by moving away from those MAGA candidates, by not selecting candidates in the primaries who support these kinds of conspiracy theories. Of course, the problem is that even though the people who support them are now in the minority in the country, they are a very significant block of Republican primary voters. And so it's unclear to me that the Republican Party will learn the lessons of yesterday's or Tuesday's elections. I hope they will. I think there's a little bit of hope here, but I don't want to exaggerate how much reason for hope there is.
Understood. Thanks, Yascha. Lily, turning to you now. what do the election results, or those that we know of so far, say about the partisan divide in the United States?
So one thing that we've seen happening over the last few decades is that the parties have become gradually socially, geographically, and culturally very different from each other. And that has over time created a really deep partisan loyalty among Democrats and Republicans, and generally a greater focus on winning elections than for example, legislating effectively, especially on the right. And so effectively what we have now is, sort of a Republican Party that has become increasingly white, Christian, rural, and a Democratic Party that is increasingly racially diverse, religiously diverse, much more living in cities or suburbs. And that makes it difficult for, first of all, Democrats and Republicans to speak to each other, to encounter each other in the real world in a way that allows them to see each other as humans. And it also creates an environment in which it seems to people like it's impossible that the other party could have won an election because they've never met anyone. And for a lot of people, they've never met anyone who voted for the other party. Uh, and in the most extreme version of this, there is, I've been seeing with my co-author Nathan Calmo increasing levels of partisans who are willing to say that people in the other party are evil, say that people in the other party are a threat to the United States, and even say that they shouldn't be treated as humans because they behave like animals. So we're getting in our most recent data up to 40% of people, Republicans, and around 30% of Democrats saying that people in the other party are subhuman. So those are all very, very worrying conditions. And I went into this election, honestly, extremely concerned that we would have ended up, yesterday and today with just huge amounts of election contestation, election rejection, particularly by Republicans who had said that the 2020 election was rigged and that Trump had actually won it, and therefore after that, per, perhaps partisan violence. That was my big concern because we've also seen escalating approval of violence for political ends, and we've seen actual escalation of violence, especially extremist right-wing violence in American politics. So it was a little bit frightening going into this. I was definitely somewhat relieved in the sense that first of all, so far it does seem that the Republicans who are losing elections are conceding without a huge fight. They seem to be conceding to their opponents and peacefully walking away, and that itself is going to reduce the risk of violence and the risk of social upheaval after this election. We can't be assured that that's gonna that no one will going into the future. I know that Carrie Lake's supporters have been started to pass around conspiracy theories about her opponent Katie Hobbs, and so if Hobbs wins the Arizona governor race, then we may end up with some potentially dangerous situations. But so far, it really seems that in most of these elections, and it's important to remember that on election day and for midterm elections, there are thousands of elections that happen in the United States on the same day, and so far it seems like most of them have gone pretty smoothly. The second thing is that there, as Yascha was saying, there really does seem to be a difference in the way that voters are viewing these sort of MAGA Republicans versus the traditional Republicans or more moderate Republicans. And there's increasing research coming out that's actually looking at Republicans who really like Trump and believe that the 2020 election was stolen, calling these people sort of the MAGA Republicans, and comparing them against people who don't believe those things. And so those are the non-MAGA Republicans. And there really does seem to be serious empirical measurable differences between these two groups of people, even though they're in the same party. And they make up about half and half. So each of them is about half of the Republican Party. That could create a scenario in the future where we end up actually seeing a rift in the Republican Party, which could really weaken the really deeply intolerance-based MAGA movement, and sort of remove it from entirely controlling the Republican Party as it seems to do to some extent right now. The other thing is that, as Yascha also said, we saw split ticket voting this election, which we hadn't seen in a long time, and a lot of people had thought was over. Not only were we seeing split ticket voting in terms of candidates, but we saw a lot of in states where there were ballot initiatives, particularly regarding abortion laws. We saw that the pro-choice abortion positions were running well ahead of Democratic candidates. So it does seem that people who did not vote for Democratic candidates were voting to maintain the right to have an abortion, meaning that independents and Republicans were voting to maintain the right to have an abortion. So it really does seem that that particular issue obviously is very important, mainly to women, but who knows? We don't know the exit polls. I mean, we don't know the actual numbers yet, but we will soon, hopefully. But it really does seem like that individual policy is actually motivating political behavior. And it's been a long time since we've seen real policy motivate political behavior. For so long, we've just been focused on who's the winner and who's the loser. And we've kind of forgotten about how legislation affects regular people's lives. So overall, I have come out of this much more optimistic than I went in. I think that we still have a lot of information to gather. We still don't know which party is going to have control of the House or Senate, and that will determine whether or not sort of how chaotic the next 2 years will be. And we obviously haven't seen the end of a lot of these elections, and can't guarantee that there won't be some election rejection in the future. But so far, my worst fears have not been confirmed, and I'm really happy to be able to say that.
Thanks, Lily. Henry, turning to you now. What do these results mean for how the US exerts power on the world stage? And I'm thinking about countering Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also more generally.
So I think that it has some pretty important implications, and I think that there are going to be a lot of people out there in the world who are going to be somewhat relieved that the elections were nowhere near as disastrous from the perspective of the parts of US power that they like, as they had feared that the elections were going to be. And I think in particular this is going to be true of most Europeans. I think that there's a lot of quiet relief in many European capitals, especially with respect to Ukraine, because one of the possible outcomes of the election was that we might have seen an empowered and substantial Republican majority in the House talking about cutting funding for Ukraine. There was certainly some noise coming out of the Republican leadership in the House suggesting that this was something that they wanted to do, although it wasn't entirely clear whether this was something that they were going to do as a bargaining point or whether this was something that they're going to stick to because of some commitment, because they believed that this was what their coalition wanted them to do. So we aren't quite sure, of course, yet what the final outcome is going to be. But at the very least, it would appear that the majority in the House is going to be much, much smaller than expected. And the upside of that is that it probably means that the House leadership is going to have enough time and enough difficulty trying to control its people and trying to get whatever its major priorities are through. And probably foreign policy is not going to be one of those priorities, which means that it's going to be much more difficult for the House majority, assuming that it's Republican, to try and press for sharp reductions in funding for Ukraine. This probably is not going to be one of the major things that they want to do, especially given that the Senate Republican leadership has signaled that they want to keep committed on this. Equally, I think that there's going to be some worry about tail risk. A weak majority might not be able to do bad things from the point of view of the US and the world, but it may not be capable of easily responding to emergencies either. So if we find ourselves in a situation where something unexpected happens in the world, it's going to be extremely hard for the Republican House leadership, even if it wants to, which is by no means necessarily a given, to provide support for any significant actions that need to be taken in order to deal with unexpected crises, unexpected emergencies. I also think that there's going to be a lot of quiet satisfaction in most European capitals that Donald Trump appears to be substantially weakened by the election. So we, of course, we can't say that the Trump phenomenon is gone or even that it is diminished, but there certainly appears to be the possibility of more contestation in the Republican Party around the fact that many of the elections which should have been winnable on their face were not winnable because of weak candidates, and perhaps because of some kind of backlash. I'm sort of along the lines of what Lily was saying. So we have seen that that anti-democratic candidates have not enjoyed the automatic support that perhaps some Republicans hoped and believed that they might. So there's been a lot of worry, I think, in particular in European capitals, that Trump might come back in 2 years. Some of them call it the T2 scenario, like Terminator 2. He's back and he's bigger and badder than he ever was. That, of course, seems to be at least somewhat less likely than it was at the moment, than it was a few weeks ago. And we also see, I think, that the general worries that also Lily talked about, that we're going to see some further evidence of real democratic breakdown. That is something that I think the fact that we have not seen that is also something that is going to be a relief to US allies in the rest of the world, and probably the cause of some significant unhappiness in Russia and elsewhere. And of course, there are some countries which are allied to the US which have different priorities. So that, for example, Hungary's Orban made it clear that he wanted to see Trump coming back and perhaps creating some kind of a negotiated resolution to the Ukraine-Russia war. People like Orban are going to be quite unhappy, and Orban's enemies in the European Union perhaps will get a little bit of succor and a little bit of increased energy and willingness to confront the authoritarians that they have amongst them as a result of the decreased likelihood that Trump will be around to mess with this in the future. So I think that there is this is probably something which has had broad benefits for the US in the world and for US power in the world. We are going to see, I would imagine, some effects at the margins. It's going to be harder for Biden, of course, to command majority, and it's going to be more or less impossible to get substantial legislation through on controversial partisan issues that might be appropriate for challenges that are faced in the world. And we also face the risk that if we see a real unexpected crisis, it may be very hard to respond to. But I think at the same time, this is a substantially better outcome than most people had anticipated we were going to see.
Thanks, Henry. And Leah, before I turn to you, I want to remind those who are watching, please do submit questions for our experts to answer. We'll shortly be moving to Q&A. I see your questions coming in. Please continue to submit them. Now, Leah, how did the massive protest movements that we've seen in the last few years, women's rights, Black Lives Matter, more recently abortion, how did those movements translate or not into the results that we've seen this week? Leah, I think we don't have audio for you.
There we go.
Thank you.
So I think the first thing to start out with is that protest movements are the lifeblood of any election. But in particular, when we have things like presidential elections, midterm elections, it's these protest movements that imbibe essentially life into these contests. And I think the 2022 election, midterm elections, is kind of a weird election. It didn't behave, at the very least, in the ways that a lot of people predicted that it would behave. And I think that is in large part because of the presence of protest movements on the left and the right, but perhaps not in the way that we would assume them to affect election outcomes. So, for example, in 2020, we heard a lot about how the movement for Black Lives actually turned itself into a voter registration drive and registered millions of new people, 26 million contacts, direct contacts, real life contacts that had a direct effect on multiple races. We can think Michigan, we can think Pennsylvania, we can think Georgia. Turnout in the 2022 election for that same group of people was actually down, but it was up in places where it counted. And that is largely due to the continued mobilizing and organizing of these various protest groups and factors. So I'll give you the example of somebody like Stacey Abrams. We all know that Stacey Abrams has been mobilizing and organizing in Georgia for years, well over a decade. She's been trying to build a new voter base that expands ideas of likely voters. Who gets to be counted as a likely voter? So she directly goes after unlikely voters. Now, in the case of the Georgia gubernatorial race, two different times in a row, she's been unable to best somebody like Kemp. So that protest movement hasn't worked in her benefit. It has, however, down ticket worked for other candidates in really spectacular ways. One of the reasons that Raphael Warnock is still in this contest is explicitly because Black voters came out for him, and those Black voters were mobilized and organized off the back of the work that Stacey Abrams has been doing, and organizations like hers have been doing over the last decade. So I think we can begin to see the importance there. I'll also point to the fact that groups were able to mobilize, a number of protest groups were able to organize under the banner of youth engagement. Now, normally young people, roughly 18 to 29 years old, have very, very low participation rates in midterm elections. Well, this year, that was not the case, right? The turnout was the second highest that we've seen since in really the last 30 years, second only to the 2018 election, which we know protest movements were an incredibly important aspect of that. But one of the things that young voters did, and this young kind of protest movement, these young people's protest movements and organizations were able to do, is mobilize young people and bring them to the ballot box in order to express their dissatisfaction with the idea of the loss of rights. So they were able to capitalize and build off of these various kind of what I might call sporadic movements that erupt in reaction to things like challenges to LGBTQI rights, the erosion of various voting rights, but also perhaps most importantly, essentially the overturning of Roe, the Supreme Court decision that was rendered over the summer. So when asked about it, young people repeatedly said these were things that were on the top of their list, along with pushing back at questions that around illegitimacy of the elections, right? They wanted to reject that resoundingly. They wanted to advocate for climate change, and they wanted to advocate for debt reform. So they wanted to make a statement that essentially was about the loss of rights over the last several years. And it's because of them, largely, that there is no red wave, that there was, a kind of red splash. I don't know what we're calling it yet. That in fact, the Democrats, despite having an incumbent president in office, and in fact having a relatively unpopular president, were only able to lose. Have so far only lost about 10 seats in the House, and the Senate remains tied. So protest movements absolutely play a role. The last thing that I'll say here too is, because I do think it's important to look at protest movements on the right, is the idea is that in some spaces, and we're going to really have to pay attention to this because Republicans underperformed, but there are some spaces across the country where Republicans were able to mobilize, organize, and generate massive turnout. In fact, turnout was extremely high for Republicans this year. So what does that mean? I think part of what we have to tease out is, even as there is a repudiation of Trump-endorsed candidates and Trump, the figure himself, there does appear to be in certain places, particularly where Republicans are able to mobilize and embrace a full-on and a full-throated embrace of Trumpism. So what does it mean to have Trumpism without Trump? And of course, the poster boy for this is going to be Ron DeSantis. He's the one to watch going forward.
Thanks so much, Leah. And now we're going to move to Q&A. We have a lot of questions coming in, so we'll do our best to get through all of them. I've already mentioned to our panelists that because they have complementary expertise, I will send questions to one of them to start, but I hope that others will jump in. And Yascha, I'm going to send this first question to you. So we don't know exactly how this is going to shake out, but there's certainly a scenario where the Democrats maintain control of the Senate and the Republicans take control of the House. What are the implications for governance in the US over the next 2 years?
Yeah, so assuming that scenario, I would say, first of all, that it's the end of a legislative agenda for the next 2 years, right? It is stasis. Clearly, if Republicans do end up holding the House, it seems likely, but not perhaps inevitable at this stage of an interminable process of counting votes in the United States. They're going to block anything important that the Biden administration might try to do. So any kind of ambitious legislative proposals that the Biden administration may have been hoping to somehow pass after the midterms, if somehow there had been a blue wave, are going to go out of the window. The other thing that Republicans will do in the House is to try and create a couple of crises. So they're likely to vote against an increase in the debt ceiling and negotiate over that. There's likely to be real obstructionism about other forms of the federal budget. So there's going to be a return of the kind of forms of political brinkmanship we've seen in the last few years, often with sort of somewhat damaging economic consequences. So far, they've never gone wrong so badly that it actually became an economic calamity, but that always remains a possibility. So that's something to worry about. And then, of course, Republicans might use the control of the House to start impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump, against Joe Biden, to have sort of various committees looking into alleged malfeasance by Joe Biden's son, etc. All of that is kind of going to be stillborn because clearly there's never going to be a majority in the Senate to impeach Joe Biden unless something very unlikely comes to light. So it'll be theatrics, but it'll be theatrics that'll drive the newspaper headlines and continue to polarize the country and be sort of quite unpleasant. The significance of Democrats holding the Senate is that in those legislative negotiations, that does give them an important trump card. It allows them to certainly stop in its tracks any attempt to impeach Joe Biden or anything like that. And importantly, it means that Joe Biden can continue to appoint judges as judgeships become vacant, that if some cabinet minister of his steps down, he's able to replace them relatively easily. So I think that sort of split between the House and the Senate is certainly far from perfect for the Biden administration. It's far from perfect for the country because it's just 2 more years where people are going to look at politics and say not much can get done. There's going to be some unpleasant elements to it, but it doesn't set up the kind of complete showdown between the administration and Congress that might have ensued if Democrats had failed to control the Senate.
Thanks, Yascha. To our other panelists, anyone else want to jump in on this one? What we're likely to see if Democrats hold the Senate but Republicans take the House?
I'll just add very quickly that I think that the size of the majority in the House will matter. You're right. If the Republicans have a 1 seat or 2 seat majority in the House, it will be very difficult for the speaker, presumably Kevin McCarthy, but whoever is elected Speaker of the House, to control them. They can't afford to have any defectors on any of their votes, right? Assuming that all Democrats vote against whatever they put up. And they've just elected a bunch of Republicans in New York who may not actually want to be as extreme as for example, somebody from Texas. And so what we want to keep an eye on is how many seats is the majority made of, and that will actually change the dynamics of the future in the House.
Thanks, Lily.
Shutting down the federal government or refusing to vote for a debt ceiling increase is easy to do if you have a big majority in the House. But if you have a few seats, I agree with Liliana that probably there'll be some moderate Republicans newly elected who say, "I don't want to be the person who makes America go into default."
So I'll just add in here too that in addition to I think a lot of grandstanding and spectacle, that we may see an increase in the way that Joe Biden uses the executive office and specifically uses executive fiat. And we saw it with Trump, we saw it with Barack Obama, people rail against it. But one of the things that has come out of, I think part of what Lily has mentioned, has come out of this deep gridlocked polarization is the necessity to use the executive office in particular ways to pass agendas that may not have longevity, but it becomes the only way to get things done.
One interesting area, of course, to look at is the debt increase and what happens to the politics of the need to increase the debt limit. I just don't have any very good sense yet of what the new constellation is going to look like. Is it going to be harder for the Republicans to bargain? Is it going to be easier? I suspect that, as Lily said, the fact that there are some New York newly elected representatives who don't want to blow things might make it harder for the Republicans to make a very strong statement on that. But also building on what Leah said, this also suggests that the Biden administration may want to turn more towards the international rather than domestic agenda for the second 2 years, because that is the area where executive power, executive authority has traditionally been at its strongest, and where it is most difficult for the Republicans in the House to constrain what it is doing. So we would likely see a lot more emphasis and focus on things that can't readily be vetoed, executive agreements and such, and efforts to try and use foreign policy perhaps even as a backdoor to trying to achieve some domestic things that couldn't otherwise be achieved with respect to climate change or so on.
Thanks, Henry. And I'm going to ask you a follow-up question that's come in. So in a world where there's a Republican majority in the House, what might that mean for President Biden's policy towards aid for Ukraine during the Russian invasion?
I think, as I said, I think that it depends on the size of the majority. Mm-hmm. And if it is just a 1 or 2 vote majority, we are probably talking about a House that is going to be crazy town. We're going to be seeing all sorts of ludicrous stunts being pulled by individual Congress people. Thomas Massey, for example, seems to be just delighted with the opportunity to sort of play havoc, perhaps, and to use a tiny minority in order to pull off various kinds of stunts. And I think that in the midst of that, I think it's just going to be very, very hard for them to mobilize to try and block substantial help going to Ukraine, especially when you see McConnell in the Senate signaling that continued help to Ukraine is something that he sees as a priority. It's so I would suspect that it's going to be hard to mobilize. So I don't think we're going to see very much new that is done, but I think that it will be hard to wind down or wind back the support that is already there. I think that's going to be much trickier than perhaps McCarthy anticipated might be when he was dreaming of a 40 or 50 seat majority.
And if I may jump in there, I agree with that. When you look at the Trump years, even the first 2 years when Republicans had a clear majority in the House, they used foreign policy as a sort of area in which they could quietly disagree with Donald Trump and put some distance between themselves and Donald Trump without being too explicit about it. So, institutions like the National Endowment of Democracy, I think there's real concern that they would be defunded, that their congressional funding would be cut by Republicans. In fact, it was vastly expanded because Republicans thought, hey, here's an opportunity to show where our values are in a way that doesn't sort of immediately attract the extreme ire of Donald Trump. So I think there will be members of a new Republican House caucus who are pro-Russian, who are very much against the aid for Ukraine. They're going to be voting against a bunch of bills. But I think there's also a real faction of House Republicans who would even enthusiastically vote for renewed aid bills for Ukraine if they're required and so on. So given the likely slim majority for Republicans, I'm much more heartened on this topic than I would have been a few weeks ago.
Thanks, Yascha. Leah and Lily, given that you both brought up the Dobbs decision and its fallout during the midterm, so I'm going to send this question to the two of you first. Leah, why don't you take it first, and then to Lily. So the question is, what role, of course, we know about Dobbs, but what role generally did the Supreme Court play in this election? And is it perhaps a different role than we've seen the Supreme Court play in other elections?
Okay, so the Supreme Court likes to think of itself as this apolitical, nonpartisan, above it all, right? We've heard the justices talk over and over again in the private conversation when they do, public talks about how the Supreme Court doesn't get into that partisan stuff. The Supreme Court has always been partisan and has always had partisan strains. You can't dance around it. But with that, the past, I think, really 3 to 4 years, the Supreme Court has become increasingly both polarized, but openly and nakedly partisan. And I think some of the justices, Roberts in particular, have tried to steer against it. But it came to a head really with two incidents. One, with Clarence Thomas's wife, Jeannie Thomas, essentially being named in the January 6th hearings about given her involvement with January 6th. And then two, of course, the leaking of the Dobbs decision before it actually happens. It's a huge, I mean, it is an incredible breach of trust. We still don't know, people on the Hill have their suspicions about who leaked it. But it laid bare, I think, the politics of the Supreme Court and the politicism of the Supreme Court in a way that past decisions had hinted at, that the justices could dance around. Now it was apparent. The other thing, something else happened too. As I think conservative sources rejoiced at the news of Dobbs, right? And we saw initially the first wave of it was politicians, activists on the right celebrating this. It quickly became apparent that they had underestimated how popular reproductive rights and reproductive choice was within the United States, even amongst conservative audiences. They underestimated it in a way that had monumental impact on the midterm election. So one of the things we saw in the lead up to the midterm is that a number of politicians, Republican politicians, tried to steer away from the question of the Dobbs decision and, pro-choice, pro-life, whatever, and in part because audiences were so angry. By and large, people who voted and said that abortion was on their top three issues overwhelmingly went for Democrats, right? When abortion was on the tickets in terms of policy for the midterm, more than 60% of audiences voted to, say women should still have the right to choose. So Dobbs plays an incredible role in the midterm election. And going forward, I think it is, it becomes one of those topics that even as it is a central part of current conservative ideology and agenda, it is now also apparent that it is a liability. Of course, the Supreme Court can continue to say, we don't care because we sit above it all, right? But the reality is that it has political impact for the party that put those people in place.
Thanks, Leah. Lily, you want to jump in on this one? Role of the Supreme Court in this election?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Dobbs decision was really just absolutely toxic for the Republican Party in a couple of major ways. And I think the first one is that it really was like the dog that caught the car. The states that were now empowered to restrict abortion after Dobbs had no idea how to do it. There were vague laws on the books already, some of which were written in the 1800s. The hospitals didn't know what to do. The doctors didn't know what to do. It wasn't clear what the standard was for what counts as an abortion and what counts as, for instance, a miscarriage. Women in a number of states were being refused miscarriage care because it's identical to abortion care. There were so many just extraordinarily messy situations. Also, they were, in a lot of these places, the pro-life movements were trying to say, like, well, now that we're forcing them to have babies, we need to help them with the cost of having babies. We need to give them diapers. We need to help them get food. And that's not what Republicans tend to do. And they didn't really have a plan for that. So they're forcing women to have babies they can't afford. And that is just an extremely unpopular thing to do. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the way that Alito wrote the decision also explicitly mentioned that gay marriage and birth control were next. And he didn't have to say that. He included them in a clause that said that basically this decision can be considered consistent with these other decisions. And it made it clear that they are thinking about potentially harming the right for same-sex couples to marry and the right for women to use, or for couples to use, birth control. That, I think, also really, it motivated particularly gay rights movements, and it I think frightened women even more than they were already extremely frightened by the abortion decision. So I think it opened up the Republican Party to accusations of, first of all, incompetence, and second of all, absolutely extreme behavior in the future if they weren't stopped somehow in this election.
Could I jump in there? Because I have a different interpretation of that ruling. I read the whole ruling, and My understanding is that the court was very clearly distinguishing between Dobbs and those other cases. So what the ruling said was, and I'm just reporting what the ruling says, I'm not endorsing it obviously, that in the case of abortion, there's a potential other human being whose interests need to be considered, and it's not the role of the Supreme Court to determine the status of a fetus. So it's not the role of the Supreme Court to determine whether or not we should think of a fetus as another moral human being with moral rights, and that's something that should be up to the state legislatures. It then distinguishes that case from contraception cases and gay rights cases by saying, there we're just talking about consenting adults. We're not talking about a potential competing moral interest on the other side. And so therefore the Dobbs ruling will not and should not apply to those other kinds of rulings. So while they did mention those other rulings, my understanding of the ruling was that they did it in a way that was precisely meant to say, these two cases are not analogous, and you should not think that the Dobbs ruling has any kind of implications for what Supreme Court jurisprudence is going to be in those other areas.
Right, but then there's a clause right after that where Alito is like, well, we should still reconsider it, right? It's still, and then he cites the Clarence Thomas piece that is a shout out to, right, like eugenics and racism and how these things could be interpreted. So I think, there are a couple of things. One, they do that. And apparently there's this whole argument with Roberts. That's one of the ideas about why it may have been leaked in order to push Alito in a certain direction and calm everybody down. And Alito refuses to walk it back. But I think on top of that, the justices have repeatedly said that there are certain things that they will not touch in the lead up, and then have shown a willingness to completely toss that out the window, right, in the aftermath of whatever case. So like we have Alito, written on tape, all of these things saying that, Roe is the law of the land, I won't touch it. And then he's the one who writes it and writes a pretty stirring opinion.
And certainly the people in Congress believed it to be a direct threat to the right to same-sex marriage, because they immediately started putting together legislation to protect that right on a federal level. And I think that part of the reason was that he lumped it together with rights of privacy. All of these things are linked together by rights of privacy, and that's something that he didn't think, that he didn't really seem to have very much respect for. But it certainly seemed to activate representatives in Congress.
So yeah, I agree with it as a description of what political impact it has. I'm quite skeptical that the Supreme Court will revisit same-sex marriage, and certainly that it will revisit contraception, because I do think that legally there is a clear distinction there, and the way that the decision was framed to me seemed very different. But I think certainly I agree on the sort of how it was read by Congress and by some people in the country who were therefore motivated to participate.
And I'm gonna jump in quickly and thank Leah Wright-Rigueur, who has to jump now, but the rest of us will be here for the remainder of the briefing. Thank you so much, Leah.
Thank you. And I have a good reason for having to leave. I have to teach. So thank you, everyone. Take care.
So I'm going to slightly switch gears now. And Henry, I'm sending a question to you. So what do we know about the role of disinformation in this election?
Not very much yet. There isn't any, and it's also a complicated question, because do you think of disinformation as being toxic lies, in which case we have seen quite a substantial amount of toxic lies, albeit perhaps they've been less effective than we had thought? Or do you think about this as being specific efforts by foreign agents of one sort or another to try to manipulate the election? In which case, if there has been that happening, it hasn't sort of been visible, and there haven't been the warnings of it and sort of playing an important role that we might have expected. What we did see, which was interesting, was a explicit admission from one of the Russian people around Putin, who had been implicated by the United States in previous efforts to try and manipulate information. We saw an admission by him, indeed a celebration of the fact that he had, yes, contrary to previous denials, he had been involved in spreading misinformation or in manipulating, and that he intended to continue to do so in the future. So I think, but I also think that the impact and the consequences of foreign disinformation efforts probably pale into near insignificance beside the fact that US politicians have become, especially on the Republican side, far, far more willing to engage in toxic disinformation than they had in the past. And like Lily, I was pleasantly surprised by the willingness of most Republican candidates so far to effectively acknowledge that they have been defeated, rather than to spread what I think is the most damaging form of disinformation, which is to claim that elections have been fixed against them when they have not. I am worried, like Lily, that that Carrie Lake, if she does go ahead and if she loses, it seems at least possible to likely in Arizona that she is going to go on the rampage. But equally, I think that this is probably less of a generally destabilizing thing than it would be if there were tens or hundreds of other Republican candidates who are doing the same thing at the same time.
Thanks, Henry. And Lily or Yascha, do you want to weigh in on disinformation, or I see you nodding?
I think there's one thing that I think sort of went under the radar, which is the at least in there's a very good example in Florida of really the state putting out misinformation to either it's unclear whether it was trying to entrap or just confuse Black voters in Florida who had criminal records and were technically not allowed to vote, but were sent ballots by the state. And when they tried to use them, they were arrested, and in sort of very public ways, and so that a lot of other Black voters witnessed it, and people who were trying to get people out to the polls were reluctant to do that because they weren't sure if they were going to be arrested for soliciting voter fraud. So there were some things that were happening in some states that were pretty nefarious in terms of trying to reduce turnout among certain groups of people, but nothing that seemed like it was a nationally organized thing, right? It was just sort of like here and there. There seemed to be misinformation that was aimed at voter suppression, and it's unclear what, if any, effect that had on the outcome. Probably not much in Florida, but I think those are the types of things that we actually saw more of, and maybe haven't talked very much about yet.
Thanks, Lily. Yascha, final word on disinformation, or shall we move on to a different topic?
Let's move on to a different topic.
Okay, final question, since we're in our last moments of this briefing, and I'm gonna poll the panel. So Yascha, I'll send it to you first. Thoughts about what we learn from these midterms as we keep an eye towards the 2024 presidential elections, new frontrunners, folks to keep an eye on. Yascha.
Yeah, I mean, I think we learned that the theory according to which Donald Trump was this unique electoral asset was probably wrong all along, and has certainly ceased to be true at this point. Republicans did reasonably well in the years running up to 2016. They did win the presidency, though without winning the popular vote and against a historically unpopular candidate. But somehow Donald Trump managed to turn this into this myth that the old Republican Party lost everything and only he can win. And that myth persisted even through a big blue wave in 2018, even through Biden's victory in 2020. At least with parts of the Republican base, I think it's going to be very hard to sustain after the failed red wave of 2022. That's a good piece of news for the country. Hopefully it'll also make it more likely that some candidate's going to start pushing against the MAGA wing within the Republican Party. I think on the Democratic side, there's going to be a lot of relief, but I think it's important for Democrats not to dismiss the polls and the research which show that they are very unpopular as well. That Donald Trump's deeply unpopular in the country, Joe Biden is also pretty unpopular. Republicans in Congress are deeply unpopular, Democrats in Congress are also pretty unpopular. People perceive the Republican Party as very extreme. I don't think the two are equivalent, but they also perceive the Democratic Party as pretty extreme. And if in 2024 they want to make sure that they can get a convincing victory against a candidate like Donald Trump, or a victory at all against someone like Ron DeSantis, I think they have to take very seriously the things that continue to make most Americans skeptical of them. My model of this election is not that people voted for the party they did because they liked it. They voted against the other party because they disliked it more. And so Democrats have some work to do on that front as well. And very briefly, one last point. There's one very good piece of news over the last 10 years of American politics. Many pieces of bad news, but one very good piece of news, and that it seems to have continued on Tuesday, but we'll need to wait for more sophisticated analyses to be 100% sure of that. And that is the ethnic depolarization of the American electorate. Knowing what skin color you have, knowing what ethnicity you belong to, tells me less about who you voted for today than it would have done 10 years ago. We saw parts of that with Democrats holding on to seats in predominantly white suburbs. We saw it as well with Republican successes in Miami-Dade and other places. That, I think, is a good piece of news for the country we should want to build, because I don't want to live in a country where I can look at you and know who you're voting for, and I don't want a country in which we're politically split between a homogeneous bloc of whites and a homogeneous bloc of people of color. I think that's something that doesn't have direct partisan implications, but that's something we should celebrate.
Thanks, Yascha. Lily, same question to you, and then Henry, you'll get the last word. So what did these elections teach us with an eye towards presidential elections in 2024?
So I think the first thing is that there was a real almost desire among kind of media commentators, journalists, to really sell this story of the red wave. And the polls didn't indicate that, right? The polls were very much, it's too close to tell. And the idea of it being a red wave was, I think, rested on some assumption that polling error in 2016 had been undercounting Republicans, but also it's a good story, right? I mean, it's a fun story. People will click on it, and that's one of the motives of news media is to get people to click on stuff. But it wasn't true. And the other thing that journalists are supposed to do is pursue accuracy, right? So if they say something is going to happen, then they should have some sort of consequence if it doesn't actually happen. And lately, what we've seen our news media doing is really focusing on getting attention rather than getting the truth, and particularly when it comes to partisan politics. And so I'm really hoping that there is some sort of, I'm not optimistic, but that there's some sort of reckoning with, understanding that the media's job is to tell people what's happening rather than tell them what they want to hear. The second thing is that this sort of common story that inflation and gas prices are the only thing that matters. All people care about is their pocketbook. They don't care about democracy. They don't care about jobs. Right? None of these things are real motivators. People don't understand democracy. People forgot about abortion, and those things just didn't seem to be true either. Right? So we have these assumptions about what motivates people to vote, and they're just not always reliable. And in fact, when you take away the bodily autonomy from half of the women in America, it shouldn't be surprising that there's a real backlash to that. There just weren't as many voices who were really explaining that part of the story.
Cillian, Henry, in our last 30 seconds, you get the final word.
Okay, so very quickly, I think that it was not a disaster for democracy of the sort that people feared, but that the slow bleed continues. And one of the lessons that I think we see, which we'll see again in 2024, is that gerrymandering works. If we look at what has happened in places like Wisconsin, if we look at the gerrymandering of Florida, it's pretty clear that had benefits for the Republican Party, and the inability of the Democratic Party to gerrymander in New York equally had important consequences. So I think that this is a bad long-term outcome for democracy, because the more gerrymandering happens, the less likely it is that local representatives will actually care all that much about what their voters think and believe. We already see that in New York. We're going to see all sorts of unpleasantness, I think, happening more and more in the parts of the country which are gerrymandered, because not just does it help cement party majority, it means that parties just have less interest and less reason to actually care about when they upset ordinary voters.
Thanks, Henry. And on that note, I will close out our briefing with a big thank you to our experts, Henry Farrell, Liliana Hall-Mason, Yascha Mounk, and Leah Wright-Reger. Thank you for joining me today, and also a big thank you to everyone who attended the briefing, and especially to those who submitted questions. A recording of this event will be made available on this website, which is the online home of the Johns Hopkins briefing. Thank you again for joining us today.